love a good circle skirt. They're great for a vintage look, they're fun, they're swishy, and they can seem intimidating to hem. But they don't have to be. I'm going to show you 5 unique ways to hem a circle skirt, each with a different approach. They're all fantastic methods for different needs, and who doesn't love options? Want a precise, narrow hem without endless measuring? I'll show you how. Need a quick, straightforward method that's my personal go-to? We'll dive into my fast and easy approach. Working with thicker fabrics or want an authentic vintage finish? I've got methods for that too. Or maybe you just want a no-fuss, gets the job done hem. Let's get into them all, starting with my favorite 2 methods. All 5 methods will be for a relatively narrow hem, which is typical for a circle skirt, whether it's a full circle skirt, a 3/4 circle skirt, or a half circle skirt. I have one of each of them here, and all 5 ways will work for any type of circle skirt. Flared skirts like this can make it difficult to turn up a hem because the fabric is longer at the raw edge than it is at wherever the hemline is. And the deeper the hemline, the more that poses a problem and the more you have to ease in that extra fabric into your hem. So for a circle skirt, it's easiest to control the hem fullness by choosing a narrow hem. For this tutorial, I'll just be using sample fabric, but I wanted to show you that the edge of the fabric follows the same shape as my circle skirts here. So let's dive into the first hem. This first method for hemming a circle skirt gives a nice, precise result and a lovely little narrow hem like this. It's nice since it involves no measuring of the depth of the hem by hand. So this is a great way to do it if you find it annoying going around the entire length of your hem measuring, because let's face it, there's a lot of hem on a circle skirt. The downside, if you want to think of it that way, is that you'll need to sew 1 line of stitches for the hem first on your sewing machine, and then a second one later if you choose to finish the hem on the machine. So make sure you have enough bobbin thread. The first step is sewing a line of stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you have a 1/4 inch presser foot like I do, then you don't need a measure, otherwise you can usually move your needle over to the right and use the edge of your regular presser foot as a guide. If it's not precisely a 1/4 inch, that's okay, and you'll see why in the next step. Because of that line of stitching, we now have the perfect way to fold up a narrow 1/4 inch hem easily along that line without having to do that by hand. Press this up along the line of stitching around the entire hem. Make sure that your stitching line is just visible when pressing so it gets hidden in our next step. Now using that pressed up seam allowance as a guide, you'll now fold this up and press it, and this time pin it into place since this will be our final hem to sew. We turn it up once on our stitching line and a second time to form the final hem. This is why I said if you weren't right at a 1/4 inch, it doesn't really matter since you're basically following the fold of the fabric at the stitching line as your guide. So this also works if you went with 3/8 inch for the hem depth or anywhere in between. Now that line of machine stitching we did basically disappears into the fold of the hem. Now all we have to do is sew the final hem. You could sew this by hand if you'd like, or my favorite, sew it on the sewing machine with an edge stitch foot. And if you don't have one, you can just top stitch it from the other side. And here's a really nice, precise finish for our narrow hem. So what if you're not familiar with an edge stitch foot, or other tools in your sewing box? Then it's a good time to check out Craftsy, today's video sponsor. Craftsy is your online resource for all things creative, with over 2,000 classes, plus an online community to share projects and get inspired. Their expert instructors break down everything you need to know. Like if you want to up your game with sewing machine presser feet and needles, because let's face it, there are a lot. You might like Wendy Gardner's class, The Sewer's Toolbox. She even covers my personal favorites like the walking foot and the edge stitch foot, which I'll be using a lot today. Or explore something totally new. I got a Cricut cutting machine for Christmas, so I have Create Stunning Birthday Cards with Kimber McGray in my queue. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description or scan the QR code on the screen will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. Valid for new members only. You can learn from live stream tutorials, join Q&A sessions, and explore their huge library of on-demand classes. Try something new this spring. Thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. The second method is probably my favorite go-to hem for a circle skirt, although the first method is a close contender. This method is generally a little bit less precise than the first method since it involves more measuring by hand before sewing. I like that this method only involves sewing the final hem though, and most of it's accomplished at the ironing board all at the same time, so it's a pretty quick method. For this method, we're going to fold up the hem and measure, but on the final hemline. So if you want a 1/4 inch hem, we'll fold it up at a 1/2 inch. If you want a 3/8 inch hem, fold it up at 3/4 inch. So that's double what the final hem depth will be. A 1/4 and a 1/4 is a 1/2 inch, and 3/8 is 3/4 inch. And I wouldn't really go any deeper than that for a circle skirt. The thing is, like I mentioned earlier, when you fold up the hem, the deeper you fold it up, the more fabric you have compared to the skirt at that hem line. So the hem allowance is a little bit flared. But we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to press it up right at the hem line. So I'm going to do a 1/4 inch hem, press it up at a 1/2 inch, and we're going to go in small little sections, not enough to press in wrinkles into the hem allowance or anything, just press right at the edge. And you can see the little bit of flaring of this hem allowance, but we don't need to worry about it. Once you get all the way around the hem, you'll now fold this hem allowance in halfway and press this into place and pin it, because this will form our final hem. You'll just use that first fold to kind of feel how far you can tuck that fabric in until you hit it, basically making this half the width of the original hem allowance that you pressed up. As I go, I kind of rock it in a little bit, if you can see, kind of scoots that straight into place where I need it. And then once it's all pinned, same as the first method, you can now sew this narrow hem either on the sewing machine or sew it by hand. And here's my second finished circle skirt hem, and this is a pretty fast and easy method. Now how about a different hem finish? This third method uses single fold bias tape to finish the hem. It basically makes a little facing for the hem. It's the only method where I didn't have an example on an actual circle skirt in my closet, so this is actually a gathered skirt. I've used it a few times when I didn't have quite enough fabric for the length of the skirt if I folded up the hem more, or if the hem would cut off a border print weirdly, like on this one. It's also great with thicker fabrics since the fabric itself is only turned up once and not twice like our previous examples. The problem here for a circle skirt is obviously knowing you have enough bias tape for the entire circumference of the hem. Here's a simple way to figure it out. Take your circle skirt, whether it's a full, 1/4, or 1/2, it doesn't matter, and lay it out flat so it's in 2 layers, just like this is here. Now you could measure the entire hem here and double it since we have 2 layers, or you can just keep folding 1 or 2 more times until you have a little bit more of a manageable length here. Don't mind that this is clearly not pressed. So this is a more manageable length here for me to measure, and I have 4 layers of fabric here. So I'm going to take this measurement and I'm just going to multiply it by 4. So I've got 36 inches here, and I will multiply it by 4. So my hem is 144 inches long total. I'd probably add a few extra inches just to be sure, so let's say 150 inches. If you're not making your own bias tape, it's sold in yards in the US, so divide your length by 36 to figure out how many yards, since there are 36 inches in a yard. So I'll take 150, divide it by 36, and that is 4.16. So basically I need a little bit over 4 yards, not quite 4 1/4 yards. That's how much bias tape I would need if I were to use it to hem this circle skirt. So here's how to do a hem with bias tape. Line up the edge of your bias tape with the edge of your fabric on the right side of your fabric. And you're just going to apply the bias tape exactly like you would anywhere else, like an armhole or a neckline. You'll sew it on the little fold line closest to the raw edge. You might also need to deal with sewing 2 lengths of bias tape together to make it continuous. And obviously you'll need to overlap the beginning and end of the bias tape when you're finished, just like I'm imitating it here. Handle it just however you normally would handle it when doing bias tape in a tube, because a hem is basically just a giant tube. Now you'll have your bias tape sewed to the hem edge of your skirt, and the rest of this is still just like you'd handle applying bias tape elsewhere on a garment. I like to press the bias tape flat first, and then you flip it over to the other side and fold up the bias tape, giving it another press to make sure that everything is nice and even, and pin that into place. So this will be your finished hem. And once again, you can finish this hem by hand, which is what I would usually do for this method, or you could sew it on the sewing machine. And then you'll have a lovely little bias-faced hem, just like this one. Now for our fourth circle skirt hem method, we go very vintage and a little bit fancy. You can finish a circle skirt hem with lace hem tape or my favorite, rayon seam binding. It's great for a circle skirt hem where you don't want to add any more bulk to the hem, same as our bias tape method, since you only fold up the finished edge of the fabric once. But it's also great because it's just a nice, pretty hem finish. This was a very popular vintage method to finish the hem of nearly any type of skirt, so you could use this method on a deeper hem for another style of skirt, but it works nicely for a narrow hem on a circle skirt too. I used this method on this quilted circle skirt where I knew I couldn't turn the hem in twice since it was too bulky, since this outer fabric is underlined with flannel. So what I used to finish this hem is washable rayon seam binding, which is often sold in a big old spool just like this. It's just like vintage rayon seam binding, except it's new. But even this brand, Hug Snug, has a cool vintage look, I think. And here's how you do it. First, you'll press up your hem right on the hemline. Remember, we're not going to be turning this hem in twice like this, so we're going to press this up on the final depth of our hem. Keep in mind that rayon seam binding is not on the bias like bias tape, and even though it's relatively easy to kind of curve into position, you don't want this to be too difficult to ease in for the circle skirt, so your hem shouldn't be too deep. I'm going to go with 3/8 of an inch. I wouldn't go more than 1/2 an inch. I probably used 1/2 an inch for the quilted skirt just because the fabric is so thick. Now once your hem is pressed up like this, we're going to fold it back out briefly and sew the seam binding onto the hem at the raw edge. This is the right side of the fabric, and we're going to sew the seam binding right to the edge underneath that fold, between the fold and the very raw edge here. If you're feeling really precise, you can actually flip the order of these two steps and instead sew the rayon seam binding right to the edge and then press it up on your hemline. So that's up to you. In this case, I'm pressing first and now I'll sew on the seam binding. Sew the seam binding onto the raw edge of the fabric on the right side of the fabric. You want to make sure this is overlapped enough with the edge of the fabric so that you catch it, so about 1/4 of an inch or so. This can be a little finicky. I like to use my edge stitch foot to try and keep the line of stitching on the seam binding on track, and I use the inside edge of the presser foot to line up with the hemline that I pressed up too. I actually personally find this easier to do without pins, but you could always pin first if you needed to. Just lift it up a lot to check that you're consistent if you're not going to use pins. When you get to the end, the easiest thing to do is to just cut off 1 inch or so and fold it back under the edge to finish off the seam binding. Now you'll just fold that back up on the hemline you pressed up earlier and give this all a good press and pin it into place because this is how you're going to sew your final hem. This can feel like a bit more fuss than the other hems, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily for an everyday circle skirt, but it's a great looking finish. Once the entire hem is pressed and pinned up, you'll sew the top edge of the rayon seam binding, or lace tape if you use that, to the skirt, typically by hand, to complete the hem. For seam binding, when you get to the part where it's overlapped at the end, like here, I usually just take an extra stitch here through that overlap to completely close it up. To finish this, you can use a running stitch or a catch stitch. I like to use a catch stitch, which is how I finished this hem. And doesn't this type of hem look nice? And we finally reached our last hem method. So last but not least, if you have a serger, you can do a super simple, fast, narrow hem. This works for casual fabrics or when you just want that hem done yesterday. It gets the job done and with no measuring. Here's how this looks on a finished skirt that I made several years ago. If you use matching serger thread like I did, it blends in really well. I'm pretty sure I got the idea from ready to wear. I think I've only used it on this one skirt, but hey, sometimes you just want quick and dirty. All you need to do is use your serger to overlock the raw edges of the fabric before you turn up the hem. Without the blade engaged, so nothing is cut off here, overlock the raw edge all the way around the hem. You could do this with 3 needles instead of 4 if you wanted to bother removing one of the needles. Now you just use the edge of the overlocking to press up a narrow hem and pin this into place. And for a quick hem like this, I honestly just would eyeball this, no measuring needed. And once it's pinned up, all you need to do is sew the hem on the sewing machine and you're done. A quick and easy hem and gets the job done. For any of these hem methods, you'll want to give your hem a nice press at the end to combat any waviness. And then go take your circle skirt out for a spin. Check out one of these other 2 videos for more sewing tutorials, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing.